it's my privilege to introduce Professor Cary Nelson. I want to give him more time to talk, so I won't talk. I'll refer you to the biography in the materials that have been handed out, and only with this addendum that he is the author of the soon-to-be released in paperback No University is an Island, which is obviously pertinent to the discussion today. Professor Nelson.
Thanks a lot. I think this may be the first conference I've ever attended where I could say that the opening night dinner, I learned enough there to make the whole trip worthwhile. And I really should rapidly revise this, but time and space and computer access prevents me. Given the topic and sort of the initial hesitation about what it means to focus on the university, something which I've been doing part-time at least for quite a few years, I simply offer a principle that a failure to reflect on how the university works will now guarantee that it doesn't work well. If we don't interrogate our own practices reflectively and seriously, then our institutions will fail. And of course, they will be run, if we don't reflect on it, they'll be run by people other than the faculty, run by other than us. In the wake of the September 11th attacks and the passage of the Patriot Act, many of us expressed concern that specific civil rights violations or infringements could impact members of campus communities. We also worried that widespread forms of surveillance outside campus could have a broader impact on campus culture. The potential impact of state monitoring of library usage, for example, could chill the climate for academic freedom and for the ability of campus communities to set their own standards for open access to information through the shared governance process. The AAUP published a substantial report, Academic Freedom and National Security in a Time of Crisis, in 2003, that detailed a number of specific and ongoing concerns. Among them are grave objection to a provision that employees served with a search warrant covering information access by others could have a gag order imposed so they couldn't tell people about it. More broadly, we offered warnings about the consequences of entangling information gathering with law enforcement, an interconnection that now seems fully and perhaps irrevocably embedded in American life, in part because the FBI was retasked to focus on gathering intelligence. Last year, we issued a sort of partly a supplementary report, also I think, which I actually co-wrote, on dealing with politically controversial personnel decisions that was largely stimulated both by the Churchill case and by a series of assaults on Middle Eastern studies programs and Middle Eastern studies scholars. I think that report that came out last year is a critical document trying to give universities advice on how to deal with personnel decisions when there is a firestorm in the public sphere. Among the most visible consequences of the September 11th aftermath, as you all know, were the repeated Bush administration's decisions to bar foreign scholars from entering the United States and visiting U.S. campuses. Tariq Ramadan and Adam Habib were among the more widely publicized cases. When, and that's only when, administration explanations could be compelled, they tended to be both flimsy and unwarranted. Ramadan, for example, had donated to a group which only later was placed on the terrorist watch list. It wasn't on the list when he donated, and the implication seemed to be that he should have, been able to foresee in the future that this was an unacceptable donation. The AAUP, the ACLU, and other groups repeatedly fought these ideological exclusions and eventually won some reversals under the Obama administration. But the truth is, the Clinton State Department is still delaying visa applications for ideological reasons. I mean, it's continuing. The AAUP and the ACLU just signed a protest letter last week on behalf of Kerem Yildiz, a British national, who's executive director of the Kurdish Human Rights Project and who's been waiting for a visa for over a year. And the Obama administration has pursued comparable arguments in another domain, defending the conviction of members of the Muslim Holy Land Foundation for donating to charities the government had not listed as affiliated with Hamas. Again, it's the Ramadan pattern, right? They donate to a charity, and then later the charity is reclassified, and then they're guilty retroactively for failing somehow to anticipate or know that. Moreover, in that case, all of the donations were used for humanitarian purposes. It's been proven. In a move that strikes against the very rule of law, the administration argued in 2010 that the laws against providing material support for a terrorist group would prohibit filing an amicus brief on the court's behalf. I mean, that bothers me a lot more than the exclusion of foreign scholars, because that seems to really strike at the heart of our legal system, that a lawyer or an organization cannot produce an amicus brief to defend a group that's accused of terrorist links, or they're providing material support. At that point, the First Amendment is gone. More broadly, it seems highly unlikely that the principle of open access for foreign scholars would survive the election of another more conservative president. I mean, I think, imagine Cary in there and what will happen to a State Department under him. While vigilance and protest have protected many of our civil rights, others have been compromised, and an atmosphere persists in which nothing is guaranteed, in which further ground could really be lost at any time. A small number of faculty members have, in fact, been taken up by the national security apparatus and had their lives substantially altered as a result, sometimes, I think, irreversibly. We need to recall, of course, that those who unashamedly serve the national security state also belong in this category. Their lives have been transformed by that service, at least in some cases, and those effects can reverberate through the academy. John Yoo at Berkeley, notorious author of the Bush administration's torture memos, unintentionally triggered a still very much unfinished national debate about the ethical limits of faculty service for the national security state. We now know, and that we didn't know during the initial debate over Yoo, that he went beyond writing policy. He reviewed individual cases and approved waterboarding. As they asked him, based on your principles, could we do it to this guy? And he judged whether they could or not. So, does academic freedom cover these speech acts? They're speech acts. They're speech that produces demonstrable material results in the human sphere. Somebody gets tortured. Did you violate the standards of the legal profession? Does he have the ethical warrant to retain tenure? At the opposite end of the spectrum, to say the least, Sami El-Arian of the University of South Florida, who has languished in solitary confinement for years, is the single most terrifying case. But he's not alone in having his rights compromised and his life derailed. Others are simply drawn into enhanced security authority that compromises them in other ways. Among them, a modest way, warrantless customs searches of computer files belonging to Americans returning from abroad. Meanwhile, ferocious objections to planned speeches by politically controversial American faculty members have certainly been given additional warrant by the post-9/11 culture. It was also much easier for the University of Illinois Board of Trustees to deny Bill Ayers Emeritus status in the post-9/11 climate. And of course, tenured University of Colorado Professor Ward Churchill lost his job as a result of the firestorm belatedly generated by his comments on the World Trade Center attack. How much self-censorship by academics has followed upon the cumulative impact of these and other events, we will never know. But I am unwilling to claim that there's been little or no self-censorship. And really, this kind of security apparatus depends upon self-censorship. That's how it works. The cases where people are actually impacted are symbolic, and they're designed to cow hundreds of thousands of others. The dominant emotion among faculty members today is fear. That's the emotion that rules campus life. And we cannot add to that fear without suffering consequences. We work in the context of at least intermittent national security intimidation, however vague it often seems until we visit an airport. The national security state now confronts what has increasingly become the insecure campus. But if I can be permitted a bit of what I will describe as speculative, constructive, or strategic paranoia, I'd like to raise a series of still more indirect concerns. I should note parenthetically that national security is itself, after all, about strategic and constructive paranoia. That's what national security is. We cannot prove that any air traveler plans to transport a bomb and a pair of shoes, but Richard Reid did in December 2001, so hundreds of thousands of U.S. airline passengers since then have dutifully removed their shoes in the security screening line. I don't object to the procedures, but they directly and collaterally affect the psychology of air travel. If your computer or your iPhone get ahead of you in the security line in LaGuardia, they may be stolen. A crowded screening line is a good place for a thief to capture your credit card number electronically. So vigilance becomes part of our daily life, at least, again, intermittently. Some accommodations to the national security state come cloaked in other guises. The abolition of don't ask, don't tell, while good news in and of itself, has given campus administrations progressive cover for reinstating ROTC, but they're doing it, in fact, in response to pretty relentless pressure from groups like ACTA and other conservative forces. As David Price, who just spoke, has shown, there are now serious new outposts of training programs for government security programs on campus. What would once have been an anathema to liberal academics is now the object, most often, of passive acquiescence. So my sort of strategic paranoia is focused on this question. What are the collateral effects in higher education? How much has post-9/11 ideology contributed to a broader surveillance culture? What, if any, effects has the national security apparatus and its accompanying cultural presence had indirectly on how we think about the aims of education and our ability to have success in fulfilling them? Is it easier after 9/11 and our subsequent accommodations to surveillance and the abridgment of various personal freedoms to subject the campus to disciplines of conformity, regimentation, and supervision that masquerade as guarantors of outcomes and performance? How much of their academic freedom are faculty members willing to cede in the context of repressive agendas elsewhere in public life? To what degree has our enhanced security climate permeated other cultural domains? Americans would like to believe that they can give up freedoms in discrete areas of their lives without seeing compromises elsewhere. Yet nothing in past history would suggest that major changes in both the character and organization of government authority, along with the institutions that serve and exercise it, would leave the rest of the country unchanged. Indeed, everything we've learned from cultural studies suggests that cultural domains, different domains, are relational, that meaning is comparative and interactive, that influences and impacts overrun our effort to take comfort in compartmentalized consciousness. That's how culture works. It's about connections and contrasts. It offers separate spheres of life, at best, only relative autonomy. The insecurity that leads academics to cede their rights has many, many sources. The relentless press, budgetary debate, and anxiety, an academic job market worsened even still by the recession, the shift to contingent positions throughout the academy with no job security, increasing administrative centralization, assaults on public employee pensions and on unionization that have escalated astonishingly in the last 8 months, wholly unpredicted. Salary and benefit concessions in private industry make academics nervous about their own conditions. the growing national political power of the reactionary right, the recent history of campus concessions to corporatization, including ceding the primary right for faculty to have control over the hiring of faculty and for faculty to have control over the curriculum. You know, those were the bedrock on which the AAUP was founded, and we, you know, our 1915 declaration, a little before my time, remains an incredibly eloquent defense of those fundamental faculty responsibilities. One would add the antagonism of boards of trustees toward faculty interests and power, anti-tenure rhetoric in the press. It's virtually impossible to find a reporter who will write objectively, let alone positively, about tenure. And of course, faculty and staff exhaustion from workplace speed up and successive budget cuts and so forth. A partial list. I can't claim to sort out all these forces and assign them relative weight. But the after effects of an expanded and invasive national security state helps provide the glue that holds all these forces together and empowers them. It helps to define the country in which we live. It reshapes the status and character of national citizenship. It augments our expectations about and acceptance of the supervisory authority of all bureaucracies, not just those charged with countering terrorism. One way to complicate this argument in a simple way is to pose a challenge. Would the University of Texas Board of Regents have been willing or able to propose the accountability and evaluative standards for faculty just recently that it did, absent a decade of post-9/11 culture? The metrics for faculty performance had strong support from Texas's Governor Rick Perry and amount to a chilling increase in supervisory and state power in the Texas system. The plan reduced standards for faculty effectiveness and usefulness to a crude form of counting, jettisoning all subtle standards of both collective and personal evaluation. How many students do you teach? How much grant money do you bring in? How many articles do you publish? Making a dramatic change in the lives of a few students, intricately mentoring students who might otherwise fail, publishing one essay that changes a field rather than a dozen that have no impact, building a career that integrates teaching and research. None of this matters in the accountability system that was temporarily at least put on board in Texas. And the data was made public, encouraging a state and national culture that conceptualizes higher education in terms of crude accounting metrics. With Florida's governor adding his voice to national endorsements of the plan, we can expect to see the Texas Academic Freedom Secession Plan spread. It may be accompanied by metrically driven performance-based salary standards, and certainly by demands to adjust pedagogical aims and practices to numerical goals. Some of us are old enough to remember that the body counts in Vietnam told us we had won the war. But I believe there was other evidence to the contrary. At the core of the educational mission, nothing that can be counted counts for anything. I'm not, by the way, in the least confident that the compromise in Texas announced more recently will do much to preserve academic freedom. It will delay implementation and allow some deployment of more subtle local standards, but the campuses are not likely to be able to jettison numerical metrics in performance evaluations. While blowback did counteract partly the profit and loss characterizations on a website for Texas A&M of faculty as being in the red or in the black. Faculty were listed by name, and it said, you know, he or she is in the red or he or she is in the black economically, either costing more than they produce or bringing in revenue, with positive or negative dollar signs effectively tattooed on their foreheads. The proposal itself has changed the character of the national debate about higher education. Ground will be lost. The Texas surveillance protocols are themselves triumphs of the national accountability and assessment movement. In addition to house-breaking faculty members, the organized assessment, accountability, and productivity measurement movement aims to force higher education to adopt testable outcomes that are comparable and potentially uniform across courses in a given discipline at multiple institutions. This movement has basically overwhelmed K-12 education, and now it includes advocates seeking to quantify higher education goals and outcomes as well. I'm opposed. The staff asked me what stand we were going to take, and I said, as long as I'm around, it's Nancy Reagan, just say no. I want to ask you, adapting a piece I did for the Chronicle of Higher Education recently, to consider the example of the humanities and social sciences at their most fierce as a telling critique of the ideology of outcomes assessment and the mechanized, uniform philosophy it invokes. In ways both subtle and not so subtle, that movement is gradually undermining academic freedom. Some of the most powerful intellectual and emotional experiences of my life have come in classroom discussions, in moments when my students and I together struggle with difficult questions and the impossibility of finding definitive answers. I am neither interested nor willing in having proto-fascist legislators, shallow administrators, and corporate flacks reduce all this to job training or to results that are quantifiable or testable. I should have found a stronger way of saying that. Much of what I devote my professional life to, I think, is increasingly endangered. From time to time, I teach a graduate seminar in Holocaust poetry. It would work as an undergrad advanced seminar as well. What would be irresponsible and possibly dangerous would be to offer it as a large lecture course, seeking high enrollment to satisfy some productivity metric imposed by Texas, Florida, or any other state, because I could get more credit for the course in their accounting system if there were more students in the room. But the students and I need to share our responses in an intimate setting. And I actually need to follow the level of stress individual students report or display one by one. The purpose of the course, one purpose at least, is to help all of us confront the infinite human capacity for evil and to evaluate literature's capacity to bear witness to it. I can track the success of the course in meeting those aims in every week's emails and discussions, but I will not debase either the process or the results by testing my students. Nor is there a proper form of assessment beyond reflection, debate, and writing to judge how severely my students have been challenged culturally, psychologically, and intellectually by the seminar. I am interested in knowing how their lives have been changed, and I track that not only through ongoing conversations and evaluating their final projects, but also through long-term interaction. Anne Frank has been repeatedly famously applauded for asserting that people are basically good. But she didn't have the opportunity to reaffirm that article of faith after Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. The seminar puts up for consideration the proposition that human beings are not basically anything, that they await culture, family, society, institutions, and indeed accident to be shaped into what they are. I have no intention of providing a multiple choice test. Human beings fill in the bubble. Human beings are basically evil. Human beings are basically good, ... Unlike the post-9/11 xenophobes who seek an absolute external enemy that has established outposts within the nation, a critical perspective on humanity recognizes that there can be darkness everywhere. All physically possible actions and behaviors, all arguments capable of articulation, fall within the parameters of the human. Nothing is guaranteed, nothing is prohibited, nothing is too monstrous to wear a human face. And the seminar reinforces relentlessly how the music of literary witness is undone by the facts it confronts. All this places a burden of pain on my students. It makes it less easy for them to live their lives. It complicates their self-understanding and their understanding of others. It should haunt the years as they go forward. Are such outcomes to be assessed? That would be an obscenity. Now, these are extreme goals, but I relate them to suggest how fundamental are the threats to academic freedom, to faculty and student rights, and to shared governance that are coalescing on the surveillance campus today. Because the experience of reading hundreds of these poems is nearly unendurable, the class offers an opportunity for all of us to come together and discover the power and value of collaborative work, the work of analyzing these texts together in detail. But I have no interest in calibrating the character of our fragile classroom community. And though the seminar is certainly an occasion to hone skills in close reading, I regard an effort to detach that skill from its historical context as an obscenity. There are those of us who want to seek compromise with the assessment and quantifiable outcomes movement, which I think will be increasingly more central to what I'm calling the surveillance campus. Let's own it and do it right, they urge. Not for what I do, not for what I teach, not for what I am calling the fierce humanities and social sciences, for teaching that seeks not merely learning, but unlearning, that seeks to unsettle knowledge and assumption in ways more fundamental than any exam can or should test. If you visit the large Holocaust memorial in Berlin, you will walk among a large field of massive granite blocks, ranged row upon row. But the stone pathways among the monoliths are not level, they undulate. And the blocks themselves are not perfectly squared, they are subtly angled and off-kilter. It's a monument to seriality and rationality unhinged, to uncertain knowledge, to human reason faltering and failing. It's often said that the Holocaust represents the dark side of the Enlightenment, the abstraction of reason, planning, and enumeration, and their severance from value. Again, we see that in the national security state in its approach to foreign affairs. How many cans of gas does it take to kill 1 million Jews? Is it more efficient to gas them or strangle them? In the basement beneath the gas chambers at Buchenwald, if you visit, you can count the hooks on the wall that served the strangling option. Keep a count, assess the cost and benefits. Of course, the many vastly different cultural practices that have operated under this epistemological warrant across time are not interchangeable. But this point of connection can give us a warning about the limits of a certain recurrent investment into ethically blind counting. For what I teach and what I seek to do, the assessment, accountability, and quantifiable outcomes movement is nothing less than a benighted Enlightenment fantasy of mastering the unmasterable, of quantifying what cannot be measured. If any teacher wants to adopt its protocols, that's fine. That's academic freedom. Just don't try to impose them on me. That is academic freedom as well. As the AAUP famously asserted in the 1915 Declaration, and nothing is more important in the post-9/11 context, we must preserve the faculty right to challenge our students. That's not what the forces aligned today against us want. Some want to reduce access to higher education so as to preserve an exploited underclass that can contribute to the wealth of a few. Others want higher education itself defanged and commodified for the same reasons. The calls to rein in and supervise and regulate higher education are lent a certain logic and inevitability by the surveillance culture we have partly adopted. We have no political party behind us supporting a more complex and unsettling view of educational aims. If there's a difference between the Democrats and the Republicans on this issue, I cannot discern it. We who teach the fierce humanities and social sciences should step forward, testify unashamedly to what we do, and create an emboldened constituency for academic freedom. Thanks. Yeah, any questions? Oh, that's right. You have to get recorded. It's our own modest and harmless surveillance procedure.
I love your talk, Cary, and the points you made about surveillance culture. And I wanted to actually ask about the AAUP's stance with regard to the BDS movement.
With what movement?
The BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement,
Oh, right.
which I very much support. And it seems to me that the use of academic freedom that's made by AAUP is such an absolutist kind of notion, as if academic freedom doesn't exist in a certain kind of context, in relation, as you said, cultures are relational, academic freedom is relational, not taking into account the complete lack of, you can't have academic freedom when your university gets bombed. In occupied territories where that happens routinely, universities are closed for months on end. And the efforts that people in the BDS movement have made to connect that with, say, opposing apartheid, as a part of campus activism. And I've been a little disappointed with the AAUP's just, we'll not budge on this. This is academic freedom. This is it. We cannot support anything like this. And I want you to just talk a little bit about that. Is there something under the absolute statement that's not quite absolute? And I really want to hear
Our whole aim was to disappoint you, but I'm not going to word. Look, remember that the AAUP did actually officially support the boycott of South Africa.
Yes.
And the difference was that that was a complete boycott of the country as a whole. What the AAUP has been confronted with repeatedly have been specific boycotts proposed toward Israeli universities, academic institutions. And I actually wavered on this for a while. I mean, I wrote something opposing the AAUP's position. My friends urged me not to print it, which I didn't do. And then I rethought it more and decided that I actually agreed that simply proposing a boycott of academic institutions would in fact be completely counterproductive. But I think it would be very hard and unlikely for the AAUP to propose a comprehensive boycott of any country, which academic institutions would then be drawn into that boycott. But I think that's basically our position is, if you simply boycott academics, all you do is prevent dialogue and conversation, in some cases with people who are, even within the Israeli state, are opposing Israeli policy. I've, of course, explicitly, personally, defended the right of Israeli academics in print a number of times to even to deny that the Israeli state has the moral legitimacy to be there. I think academic freedom should encompass the right of a faculty member to say, this country in which I live has no moral legitimacy to exist. And that's a pretty, that's about, in terms of the nation state, that's about the limits of the exercise of academic freedom, right? To deny the state having any validity. And I've defended that in Inside Higher Education, in the Chronicle, and elsewhere. So, we have walked a kind of complex position. The AAUP also officially criticized, condemned Israel for denying Palestinian students travel rights. So, we've tried to walk this line where we defend exchange of ideas and openness of relationship with academic institutions, in part because we know they include real diversity of opinion, and that's critical to a dialogue ongoing. But I don't think the organization would take a position against a comprehensive boycott of Israel, or for that matter, of what's been proposed in the last year, which is a kind of escalating staged series of economic boycotts. Boycott these industries, start with industries actually exploiting the occupied territories, boycott the products from those industries. If that fails to move the state, move forward, and so forth. So, that's, you can still disagree with that position, but I think it's consistent with our notion that academic freedom is a benefit that should not be directly and specifically compromised. But obviously in the boycott of South Africa, academics were affected just like everybody else.
Thanks.
If you look at Inside Higher Education and look up the essay Neve Gordon's Academic Freedom, you'll see a piece I did defending his right to advocate for boycotts, for which he's been severely attacked in Israel. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to voice a question for you. There are a couple universities in China that are aiming at becoming top-tier world global universities. They have some obstacles to overcome. And they've developed a measurement methodology that has now sort of been offered in terms of product of how many Nobel laureates can we get, how many research kind of focus areas that we can sponsor that have global impact. I don't know all the metrics that they're doing, but they actually just sort of proposed it, and it's sort of floating out there for academics to say, well, how does my school measure up against this common, hey, this is a tall person in a university. You have some physical characteristics. They're trying to do that in a more substantive manner. Could you comment on whether that will be some mode versus government saying what your measures are?
Well, actually, I don't know. I mean, I've heard a lot about Chinese effort to expand and the kind of hiring that they've done for their institutions. I've talked to people a bit about the level of academic freedom for students in some Chinese universities, and it's not all that I might want it to be. That particular program I hadn't heard of, so it's a little hard to take a position on it without knowing more about it. But I think, you know, one fundamental principle, at least for the AAUP, although we have rather limited authority in mainland China, is that, you know, assessment methods should come from the faculty. In other words, it shouldn't come even from the administration of a given school, but you need faculty buy-in, you need faculty planning. I was asked recently in a school in Georgia that's under a lot of pressure from the sort of K-12 constituency. And by the way, the entrance point for some assessment and accountability measures for higher education will be because all of the case law says that the state has has rights to be concerned about the outcomes of K-12 education and has a right to intervene and control it. So what happens when you're teaching teachers at a university to operate in the K-12 environment? That's going to be an entree point. But in any case, I was asked by a dean who wants to respond to increased pressure from the state agency about having more reliable and conforming outcomes in classes for teacher training. And she said, why don't I impose uniform final exams on everybody and uniform syllabi? And I said, well, the AEUP would say, if you want more reliable information, ask the faculty to come up with a system that they're comfortable with. Don't impose it on them. So I think, you know, we're such a faculty-driven organization that if one felt faculty at a given institution in China freely chose a particular system, we would endorse it. Now that, you know, whether they freely chose it or not is kind of the key question. One would need to know a lot about that. But I think that's the only sort of principled advice I can offer. Beyond that, I'll have to find out more about it. Hi.
Hi. I'm probably going to make myself a little unpopular here because it's mostly professors, so I apologize. But I just read your.
We feel really good about ourselves when a student has a chance to ask a question. We think, God, what democratic people we are. So don't worry. You've got some territory. You've won some territory anyway.
While you were speaking, I read your article about tenure. Mm-hmm. And just one quote that popped out at me, just about how tenure doesn't. It says here tenure doesn't protect bad professors, and it just not from my experience at Case, just my experience in undergrad. No, Professor Straswell was a great professor last year for me.
We hope to get rid of him, but it's been a really hard slog.
But it just seems. In contrast with my own undergraduate experience, just in particular, one tenured professor that handled my major in the communications area that, her book was a joke. Her classes were incredibly repetitive. She often made highly culturally insensitive, remarks and complaints that were made to the administration. It was come back. The answer was it's not that simple. She's on tenure, that kind of thing. So I was just, in those instances where it does seem that poor educators are protected by tenure, what would your response to that be?
Well, I would just say, first of all, that it's not a system designed to protect incompetence. There are supposed to be mechanisms to review faculty performance. You're supposed to be able to establish a record. The department head should be willing to document complaints and establish a dossier of them over time. And then one is supposed to be able to have a hearing adjudicated by peers that decide whether the person's performance is really serious enough to warrant removing tenure. I'll say on my own campus, there's been a kind of less severe step, which has been to take people out of the classroom sometimes if their colleagues support it and assign them to different tasks. Low-level administrative tasks. They retain their salary, but they're not actually in the classroom anymore. And I've seen that happen quite a few times. I've certainly seen faculty members who were guilty of sexual harassment not only removed from the classroom, but fired completely, or, as has happened several times, getting them to reach the point where they agreed that they should resign from their position. So that's at my own school. I've seen quite a few people who had tenure who are either no longer in the classroom or no longer have any jobs at all. That said, are there institutions that don't have the backbone to initiate proper review procedures for incompetent people? I'm sure. I mean, the idea that there are no incompetent people protected by a tenure system that at their own institution is not properly enforced and regulated and overseen, I'm sure. I mean, that's part of the price for providing job security for people who are very good but outspoken. I mean, tenure doesn't guarantee that people will be courageous. It just protects the few who are. And that's an important value. But the system is supposed to have built into it the ability to review cases and either seek people to improve their performance or eventually move them out of the classroom.
Unfortunately, my dilemma now is that even though what I'm doing is rigidly adhering to the schedule, everyone will assume I am heading off the dissenting view on the quality of my teaching. Talk to the students afterwards if you want to know. But we do have the next panel to hear from. Please join me in thanking Professor Nelson.